Hi, so I guess we're going to get started here if we are ready. Good afternoon. My name is Chris Purdy. I'm the Prairies Bureau Chief for the Canadian Press, which is the national newswire service here in Canada. And I'm honored to be here today to introduce these amazing journalists from all over the country to talk about their experiences and their coverage of the Pope's apology for the Catholic Church's role in residential schools in Canada. I know all of you know what a big story this was last year. It was historic and it was difficult, and it was something residential school survivors and their families had been waiting for many years. In Canada, the Catholic Church was responsible for running more than 60% of these institutions, where 150,000 Indigenous children were forced to attend, and where so many suffered abuse, and where we are still seeing evidence of the horrors as unmarked graves are discovered. Pope Francis first apologized to a Canadian delegation of survivors and Indigenous leaders at the Vatican in April of 2022, but it was his apology a few months later in Canada that many said was so much more important. And I know covering the story was grueling and emotional. You have people revealing their trauma right in front of you as you are working, as a journalist covering the biggest story in the world, and carrying the weight of what this apology means for thousands. So today we're going to hear from those amazing journalists, all amazing women. And I know some were in Rome for that first apology. Two of these journalists here were on the plane with the Pope, the only Indigenous journalists in the world to be on that plane for that historic trip. And we have journalists who were on the ground covering this visit across Canada. I also need to say some of these journalists are going to be receiving awards tomorrow night, so congratulations to them. And you will also see that there's been a bit of a change in the panelists here. So we're going to start with our surprise guest, Dani Paradis. She's with APTN in Edmonton. She covers Western Canada. Then I'll just keep going. I'll introduce everyone at the start here. Brandy Morin is sitting next to her. Brandy is a journalist from Treaty 6 territory in Alberta. We have Willow Fiddler. She is a reporter for the Globe and Mail. She covers Northern Ontario and Manitoba. And I think I can see Ganesio Deer is a reporter with CBC Indigenous. She covers communities across Quebec. Brittany Hobson is with the Canadian Press. She's based in Winnipeg. And Leitha Kochon is based out of Yellowknife. She's a producer for 6 Indigenous language broadcasters on CBC Radio. So maybe, Dani, you want to start talking about your coverage and how it went and how you felt about it.
Okay, hello. Tansi, my name is Dani Paradis, or She Carries Knowledge is my Cree name. I had just started at APTN when my first big story was the papal apology. So that's a little nerve-wracking starting at a new place and having this whole story where you know that the eyes of the world are on the coverage that you're doing. I covered Edmonton, the Commonwealth, also the Sacred Heart Church of the First Peoples. I snuck in the Sunday before to attend the church and see it had been newly renovated, and to speak with the pastor there, who is fluent in Cree. I'm still trying to get this story, actually. He's South Asian. He has spent some time in Saskatchewan, and he's fluent in Cree. So I've been really trying to hound him for a story to find out, how did you become fluent in Cree, and like, what was your passion? But I haven't yet got him. We were also in Muscatchees and Lac Saint Anne. I wrote a profile about Dr. Wilton Littlechild. You'll all remember the moment that he gave the Pope the headdress and sort of the gasp that was heard around the world. I have to say, reflecting on this time, my favorite day was Lac Saint Anne. It's a beautiful place if you've been. It's an Alberta lake. It was newly paved and renovated, and there's a pilgrimage that people go to every year, even when the Pope is not there. And the waters are supposed to have healing properties. So it's a beautiful, magical place. I remember sitting beside Brandy, and watching as the Pope, who at that point was not well and was rolled in a wheelchair. I guess talking to the folks in the newsroom, it kind of had a beach festival vibe because people had blankets and people were, relaxing in the fenced area, and it was not quite as formal as some of the other events that we had been to. And one of my favorite parts was just the generosity of people. You had people coming up who wanted to tell their story, to tell their experiences. Both in Muskecheese and in Lac St. Anne, they brought pictures of loved ones who didn't live long enough to hear the apology. And they brought that so that their family could be with them. People who wanted to show that for them, they were forgiving. That was like a very important thing for quite a few people that I talked to. For others, they were receiving the apology, they were processing it, they weren't sure. And of course, it might be somewhat of a self-selecting crowd. A lot of people there were ready and wanting to hear an apology. So what also struck me was while you're covering an event like this, you experience people on the ground, and it's so different than how you, when you see the national coverage or the opinion pieces, like it feels like a disconnect from the people that you talk to and then the people, like the opining class. Which I still think about when I go to cover large pieces. I think that's it for me.
Hi, thank you, Danielle, for sharing. So I went to Rome as a freelance journalist. I covered those meetings for Al Jazeera English along with my colleague, photojournalist Amber Bracken. I had been preparing for a number of months to go, but I wasn't prepared for the whirlwind that it was, because not only was it literally like decades of anticipation of survivors and families leading up to this big event, but it was like a kind of like a media circus there that I'm not used to operating in, and literal like paparazzi. That's where the Italian name came from. The media there is so aggressive. They were very, very disrespectful. That was a challenge. And then the Vatican was very, they put a lot of restrictions on the media, and they dictated what we couldn't do and where we couldn't go. And that was a little bit frustrating. Some of us found ways to sort of meander around that. Some of us faced consequences for that. But as soon as I stepped off the plane in Rome, that whirlwind hit me. And it was heavy emotionally, spiritually, and physically, because when you're on the ground, you're working from morning till night, and it gets crazy, and you're interacting with people who, like Danny said, are sharing their trauma. And when you're doing that on a continual basis, it gets very, very heavy. But I encountered a mix of different opinions about what was happening, even when I was in Rome. So even like people that were there physically who had either been invited as part of the delegation or to help display Indigenous culture, or survivors. Some were enthusiastic, such as Chief Wilton Littlechild, who I profiled for many years, profiled his journey to Rome. It's something that he had literally prayed for since he was a kid. And here he is in his late 70s, having trouble walking after he had gone to Rome many, many times before, advocating for this. And then seeing him, the apology happen on his actual birthday. and seeing him get up and dance in St. Peter's Square to celebrate was just a really powerful moment. And I have to say that when we were there, people weren't expecting the apology to happen. Some people were maybe anticipating, or what if, but we weren't expecting it to happen. I think people thought, well, we're going to invite him to native lands, and he's probably going to maybe make an apology there. So that day when it did happen, everybody was shocked. And I was in the press room, the Vatican press room, and I remember just being stunned that it had actually happened. And so that whole experience, and being there and seeing the celebrations and the people dancing, is something, but it wasn't yet ingrained. It wasn't yet solidified until he came to Canada. And so when he made that promise to the survivors and the leaders that he was going to come to Canada, they were holding him to that. And to a lot of them, it wasn't going to be official. And so in between, because of his health, and he had canceled other engagements in other places in the world, they were unsure if it was going to happen. So when he did make it over, and when he did come to Indigenous territory and apologize, I think for many of those survivors, that was the moment for a lot of them when they felt that they could release what they had been, holding on to. At the same time, like Danny said, some people were, indifferent to it or numb, and some were angry. I was there when Sipiku, a Cree woman who had traveled from Winnipeg, and she went to Musqueam, and many of you might have seen her on the TV or online, where she spontaneously started singing in Cree, and she cried out at the end, and the emotion on her face was like extraordinary, and that was a spontaneous moment. And there was all of these kind of little powerful moments that happened, and some of them weren't captured, on the camera. And I remember going to Musqueam because the media was sent on these buses. We always had to go on these buses and be on this schedule. Even though I lived kind of around there, I couldn't drive my own vehicle. And I have reported out, in that community on and off for years, but people had come from everywhere to gather. And there was even people that came up from south of the Medicine Line, the Indian boarding school, some of the survivors from there when they heard. I remember driving up in this bus, and I could see in the distance, there's the powwow arbor where this was happening, and I could literally see droves of people walking, and they're all Native people, and that moment, like, I just started bawling in that moment, because it was almost like this pilgrimage for them, and yet there was so much controversy because some people were out picketing and saying, we don't want anything to do with it. We don't want the Pope here. I could go very on and on, but I ended up covering, Alberta, Lac St. Anne, all the way to Quebec and Iqaluit. And I think what brought it, I guess, full circle up till that point was in Iqaluit towards the end. A survivor named Pita Urick, I think that's how you pronounce his last name. He had danced for the Pope, and at the end of his dance on that stage, he had this big, beautiful drum that they were drumming with, because they dance and drum at the same time. And he was a survivor at one of the most brutal residential schools up in Nunavut. And he walked up to the Pope, and he gifted him this drum. And I was just stunned. And the Pope said, "I'm sorry," in Inuktitut. So up until then, that was just a really powerful moment that I witnessed of this capacity to forgive these horrors. But then I said, when the Pope left on the plane, when he admitted that genocide had happened to Indigenous people, that journey doesn't end. That journey is just beginning. And we could go on from there, but I'm going to pass it to Willow.
Thanks, Brandy. Hi, Bonjour. I'm Willow Fiddler. I'm a national reporter for the Globe and Mail newspaper. I'm from Treaty 5 territory in northwestern Ontario, but I report out of Thunder Bay, Ontario. So I was reporting, I went to Rome for the Indigenous delegation that went to the Vatican in April, or when was it, March, April of 2022. And then I covered the Canadian visit from home in Thunder Bay. I did not go to any of the locations the Pope was in, but reported on some of the events that took place, including the headdress that was given to the Pope. And I also reported on, did a little story on the Indigenous humor that we saw during the visit too. The level of emotion, I think, during both the Vatican visit and the Canadian visit really is something that stuck out the most to me. A lot of anger that we saw, and that was, I found really interesting, because as Brandy had said, survivors are all kind of at different stages of their healing journey. You know, all survivors aren't kind of going through they're all at different stages. And that was one of the other big takeaways that I learned from covering this, was just there's some survivors who are now at later ages in their life coming to terms and starting to talk about what happened. Others have been doing this for decades and continue to do that work. But there was the emotion is still there no matter, I think, where you are on your healing journey. And a lot of that is anger, but a lot of saw too was humor, right? I mean, as Indigenous people, we're really good at kind of making light of certain situations, especially when things get really dark and too serious. And the headdress story, so you guys, not too long after the headdress was presented, and like, it seemed like as Danny said, like a gasp was heard, right? But then people were so angry. But then it wasn't long until we saw the KFC Colonel Sanders meme, right? Like, this is the only white guy who deserves a headdress. So I wrote a story on that because I thought, well, you know, we do kind of need that relief. Things get so intense. But I'm also kind of, to be honest, kind of glad that I wasn't on the Canadian tour, because I think, for me, the level of emotion, especially in Canada, was way higher during the Canadian visit than it was during the Vatican. Things were still really intense during the Vatican, but my personal observations was that I don't know if I could have handled it being on the Canadian tour personally. And yeah, so there's a couple of takeaways. I want to touch on what Brandy had mentioned about Indigenous media not having access to certain events during the Vatican visit. They were very, very strict about where we could be, when we could be there, what our access to the survivors and the delegates were. And some of that was for good reasons, because I did hear kind of back and forth. Like, I've heard different things from survivors and people who were there. Like, I happened to overhear conversations, people talking. And you know, some people wanted us there as Indigenous journalists because they knew, you know, that we could that we had that perspective, that we had, you know, that we could kind of be respectful in that way with their stories. But then there were others who wanted the space and didn't think it was appropriate for Indigenous journalists to be at every event that they were scheduled for, just because it was so personal for them too, and that they deserve some of that respect, and to have that kind of time alone. So it was a difficult, challenging balance, but I think that's a challenge that we've all had and have experienced already.
Did you get kicked out of? You got kicked out of the art gallery, right? they were so bad.
So funny. So I did get, well, so there was, part of the tour was the tour of the Vatican Museum, where they had brought out certain Indigenous artifacts, and that was strictly for survivors. But some of us journalists kind of like went with the group anyways and snuck in there and was able to get, for example, I was able to get some photos of the artifacts and the stolen artifacts that need to be returned. And then we were kicked out shortly after. But once they kind of saw, right? Yeah, they were gifted. But they did, once they caught on that we were the journalists or whatever, they did ask us to leave and kick us out. I kind of stuck around at that particular event and actually snuck into the lunch that they had for the survivors. I'm an intergenerational survivor. I'm also a direct survivor in a very interesting way. And I don't tell a lot of people this, but I went to one of the very last residential schools that closed in Fort Capel. At the time, it was run by the local First Nations, as was very common in the 70s and 80s. Local First Nations started taking over control over the residential schools. So that's what happened in Lebret. And I ended up going there. It shut down, I think, the following year. Same thing kind of happens in Sulicut, where I am also from in Northern Ontario. They have one of their residential schools has been operating as a First Nations high school since the late 70s, I think, early 80s. So I got sidetracked. What were we talking about? Getting kicked out. So I snuck into the lunch. So that's the other thing. So the other challenge, right, was when you're under those kind of strict media conditions, but you're an Indigenous journalist with very close connections to these stories that you're sharing and telling, and it's so personal for you. I feel we have to take advantage of that, and we deserve that access to these survivors who are trusting us with their stories, if that's what they want. So it should have been their choice whether they wanted kind of media around. But at the same time, I get it. It was a huge delegation. There were hundreds of people there. It was difficult. And again, the survivors are all at different stages of their journeys. So some of them are fine with sharing. And that's the other thing. The survivors who are so gracious with their time with us journalists, there was one in particular, her name's Angie Currar, and she's from in Alberta, Grand Prairie.
Yeah, it's close to there. She's the Métis, right?
She's a Métis elder, and she's in her 80s now, but she had only started her healing journey in her 60s, so just a couple of decades, but she's been amazing, and she's so gracious with her time. And I just, the time that she gave me to tell the stories, that, she was there when the Pope apologized, and I was able to get her, reaction. She's still a very strong Catholic, and so it was a very meaningful apology for her in that regard. And just to have, it was just a lot to process. The other part I wanted to share, because the audience is that the Indigenous delegates had. So there was the Métis, First Nations, and Inuit, and they all three groups met separately with the Pope in private audiences, and then they had the final audience on the last day, and that's when he apologized, and all three delegate groups were in there, supporters, everyone, and she's not here. I really wish she was here, but Donna Sound from CTV managed to get into the final audience. And no, because they wouldn't let media, very strict, no media allowed in there. But she got in there because she knew somebody who was in there, and they were allowed to sign people in. So she was signed in as someone from her First Nation. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's how kind of we operate. If we know somebody, like, hey, uncle, hey, cousin, let me in. That's how we get into places, and that's how we get our access. And that's exactly what she did at the Vatican. It was wild. Like, good for her, you know? Yeah, those. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Hi everyone, Kahnawà Deer. I'm a reporter with CBC Indigenous. Myself and Brittany were on the Papal plane. We were the only Indigenous reporters on that plane. All the reporters were at the back of the plane, so we actually didn't really get to see the Pope like lounging or see if what kind of like entertainment he watched on the flight.
Yeah, what he ate.
Yeah. They did feed us really well. So I actually, when you guys were at the Vatican, I was just coming back from like 4-month stress leave, and I was upset and complained to my manager about the delegation that CBC actually sent. I felt like there wasn't enough Indigenous representation in the reporters and producers that were sent. So lo and behold, a couple of months later or weeks later, they're like, "Do you want to go on the plane?" And I said, "Sure." I was terrified. I've never traveled alone, really. And yeah, by the time, like, we actually had to fly to Rome to get on the plane to go to Edmonton. That was one of the requirements. I thought I was gonna get lost in the airport because the cab driver from my hotel said that terminal did not exist. So they dropped me off at the wrong terminal, and I was literally crying by myself. Luckily, we had a group chat, and the guy from Reuters picked me up along the way. So super thankful for that. And also with CBC, I wasn't the only CBC journalist. We also had our Rome correspondent, Megan Williams, and super thankful that she was there because I do not speak Italian. And it was really interesting because the majority of reporters who were on the plane, you know, this was just another Pope trip, like, that they're covering. They really, like, they have a routine about how to do everything. And so that was a really big learning curve. I was there specifically to do digital, like, web writing coverage for CBC. I wish I could do more, and I was hoping to do, like, a lot of, you know, like, just like doing a rant to reel, like, on my phone, and the service on the plane was so bad. It took forever just to upload photos, so I felt like a lot of the stuff that I wanted to share was just getting delayed, like getting to my actual team. So that was like I think a big challenge. And then, what was another thing? I took little notes about what I wanted to say. I found the foreign press was very aggressive, as Brandy said. You know, there was a lot of discussions about the doctrine of discovery, right? And I felt like, you know, heard people on the plane laughing and like making fun of, you know, Indigenous people who are calling for the doctrine of discovery and papal bulls related to that to be rescinded. So that was very frustrating. And then also, so we didn't get to ask the Pope any questions until the end of the trip. And that was on the plane going back to Rome after a long day. And the way it works is the questions go by country. So Canada got 2 questions, and we got to ask the questions first because we were like the host country for this trip. And so we got to decide among all the reporters from Canada. And it was decided fairly quickly that myself and Brittany would ask the questions as the only Indigenous journalist on that plane. And I ended up going first, which was terrifying. And I don't know if you guys have ever been on a press conference on a plane, but it was wild. You know, the window seats were just all cameras. And then we were in the front, and the Pope just came and sat there right in front of me. And, he doesn't speak English very well, so I asked my question in English. He had a translator speaking, it was in Italian or Spanish?
I think it was Spanish, because he mostly speaks Spanish.
Yeah, and then, so his answer was then, translator was telling me in English. So it was also very hard to I'm trying to acknowledge what he's saying, not understanding, and then listening to the translator, right? And I had asked about the calls to rescind the papal bulls related to the doctrine of discovery. And he didn't understand my question. He asked me to explain what the doctrine of discovery was. So I felt dumbfounded, and then having to explain that to the Pope.
You did really good though. But then we were talking afterwards, we're like, was he just playing dumb or does he actually not know?
I still don't know. Because I had to explain it twice. And then he didn't really answer the question. He talked about how colonization was bad, and that was it. He went on and on and on, and it was like there was nothing worth quoting here. And then I'll let Brittany talk about it later. She asked about genocide, and I just remember looking at her and I was like, there's our headline. But it was agreed upon that after the plane landed back in Rome, that we had X amount an hour, maybe 2 hours before we were allowed. It was the embargo. From his press conference. And also, the press conference was after we took off, and then people were writing in the dark and trying to sleep at the same time. So that was also very stressful. And I remember checking into my hotel and my room wasn't ready, so I was literally in the lobby writing the story, and I'm like, I gotta get it out before Brittany does. And I so early, and just sending it, knowing none of my team is awake yet, and being sending it to Web Flag, being come on, get it out. And then I went on vacation and got COVID. But I think just the overall experience, you guys talked about it, it being emotional and stuff. And for me, I felt like my brain was just on robot mode, because the whole time I felt I didn't get actually to speak to any survivors. I barely got to interact with the people on every trip. We really, I felt like I felt like a sheep. We were cordoned off to wait for the Pope to arrive to do a photo op, and then we got move, we were literally running across a field, to get a better shot of him. And then we barely got to, listen to his whole speech before we were, herded back onto a bus to a next location. So that was kind of a really, I think the disappointing aspect of being on the plane. I don't regret it, but it was the only time I got to do some original journalism was when I skipped going to Saint-Anne-de-Beaupré in Quebec City, to actually go and talk to people. So I think that was kind of and I was on the Doctrine of Discovery and that was when they unfurled the banner. So I was like, it was related to my story. But, that was kind of frustrating, not being able to actually talk to people, and just having I think negative experiences with some of the other reporters. It was very clear that they didn't really care about this trip. On the plane, we were the only ones that asked about residential schools, about his trip to Canada, about the apology. Everything else, one reporter asked, do you feel more like a Jesuit than a Pope? That was. And I understand every country and they have their own needs, right? And these are the opportunities that you get to ask him a question, but it felt kind of disrespectful. And just also hearing that, the jokes about that, someone had said, I'd rather rescind this press conference, and things like side comments like that, and just being aggressive in the field. I remember waving to Brandy and chatting with her, and then someone yelling at her for being in a shot, and things like that were kind of frustrating. And it was just very clear that they didn't have a lot of experience and knowledge about covering Indigenous communities. So yeah, that was my experience.
Oh, hello. My name is Brittany Hobson. I'm from Winnipeg, born and raised, but have ties through my mother, Tammy Hobson, to Long Plain First Nation, which is not too far from here. I'm a reporter with the Canadian Press, and I've been there for just over 2 years now. Chris at the end is my boss. This was not a story that I expected to cover in the way that I did. I remember Chris, my boss, calling me up one day saying, "Do you have a passport, and how do you feel about going to Rome?" I was like, yes, I do have a passport, and am I the person you want to send to Rome? And so we had a conversation, and I said, first and foremost, our coverage is going to be survivor-led, if anything, and we're going to do well by the survivors. That was my main goal, and I'm like, I do not want to harm any other survivors. This is a big deal, and so we did that, and Kahnawà talked a lot about the challenges, and I think I'll just echo that one of the things I found the hardest was that, you essentially were not speaking to people on the ground because you were being herded from place to place, and it was very hard. I'm so used to speaking to people on the ground doing the work. That's the kind of coverage that I do and take pleasure in, and just to be shipped from one place to another, and then trying to speak to people, but being cognizant of not wanting to rush them, and it was just really hard and a little bit frustrating, but I had a really good team behind me we had people on the ground. I was feeding things back to people in the office. They're putting together the stories, and I think and I hope that we did do good by them. I will just talk maybe a little bit about one of the moments that stuck out for me, and I have written about this in kind of a self-reflection. It was when we were in Muscatcheese, and it was when the apology was happening at the community's powwow arbor, and I was sitting at the back and kind of just chatting with people, sending quotes back to the desk, sending color. People don't know that, just the general vibe of what's going on. And, he apologized. And for a moment, I just stopped. I was not a journalist in that moment. I just stopped and kind of sat with that and took in everything, This was a moment that survivors have been calling for years, and everyone was expecting it, but I don't know, I feel like everyone kind of had to sit with that. And then I was looking around me, and I saw, cookums and grannies in their wheelchair and their family members. It was a very windy day, putting a blanket over them and making sure that, getting food for them. There was health workers, checking on people. There was, jingle dress dancers, little children running through the field and laughing, and there was boisterous anti-laughs. And as this historic moment is happening, and you're talking about years and generations of trauma, and just looking around, I was they did not succeed in what they wanted to do. And that was a very powerful moment, and one that has stuck with me for a very long time, and I'm very gracious that I got to be there to experience. I'm very gracious that Kahnawà was there, because I was very concerned, and then she messaged me on Twitter and was like, "I heard you're on the Pope plane," and I'm like, "Yes, there's another Indigenous journalist on the Pope plane," and the fact that we got to ask the questions, and yes, I did ask the Pope if he considered what happened genocide. And honestly, I was surprised by his answer, because he was very yes, this was genocide. I was a little bit because he's it's a technical word, so I wouldn't think to use it, but everything I've described it as is genocide. And I was well, I don't know. You could have described it as genocide in your apology to survivors because that's what they wanted to hear. Like, that's kind of where we got the question from when we were all sitting down. Like, I had noticed just on my Facebook people saying, like, this was genocide. We wanted to hear him say that this was genocide. And I know that when we were talking about asking the questions, one of the things came up was because the TRC has called it cultural genocide, and that was the language they were going to use. And I said, no, we have to ask if it is genocide, because we have now known, like, you know, it's genocide. United Nations, like UNDRIP, or United Nations definition of genocide, it is genocide, and calling it cultural genocide is kind of giving him some leeway. So I said, nope, we have to ask if it's genocide. And, you know, I think, like, I didn't realize at the time, I think because I was so exhausted and just, like, trying to write a story before Ganasino. I think at one point I was, like, sitting on the plane like this. I had fallen asleep with my laptop like this. And it was just, it was, and actually, Chris, the time change, I think it was like 2 a.m. over here, but she had stayed up, and when we landed, like, we were talking, and we're like, Kate, we're gonna alert this is what we're gonna do, so very grateful for
I don't know who won.
I don't know either. Also, sitting in my hotel lobby, just exhausted, and they wouldn't let me check in, and I was like falling asleep in the hotel lobby, but it was a big moment, and I don't think that I really fully understood that until, so I filed my story, it was done, and I'm like, I need to sleep. Like, I have been up for 24 hours. And I went to sleep for a little while, and I woke up, and my phone was just blowing up. And I was like, oh, wow. People were messaging me. They're like, oh, my gosh. It was just wild. And it was crazy. And I will add to what Ganasio said, I was very disappointed that none of the other media asked about the trip. This was a trip that was designed around an apology that has never been done. There has been previous popes that have apologized, but there's never been a trip that was designed around an apology. And the fact that, like, none of the other media really, I don't know, it was very bizarre. I think I'll leave it at that.
Merci. Sinla Lisa Kushansidi, Super Kongutsa. Der Lipop, Jondan's Kahnawà go, he do a kitsaku. I'm Lisa Kochon. I work in Indigenous languages. I work for 38 years for CBC in my language. And the last 2 years, I became the producer for the Indigenous languages, 6 languages. And 5 Dene languages and 1 Inuvialuit. And we covered the Pope's visit, and we went to Edmonton. We didn't think we were going to go. We wanted to, because the first visit in Fort Simpson, we didn't attend the visit there. We covered from the station in CBC in Yellowknife. And so we wanted to be there this time for our listeners, because we knew that a lot of them couldn't make it to Edmonton. It's very expensive, and the people that we wanted to broadcast to are the people that were left behind. And a lot of them depend on our translations, our language on the radio. And so that's who we wanted to be there for. About the apology, some of them went to residential school, but some of them just went maybe a year, 2 years, and they rather hear it in their language. And our elders, a lot of them didn't get educated, so they don't know anything about, they don't speak the English language, they can't read. And when they're watching TV, they're just watching the pictures. And so we wanted to be there for them. So last minute we found out that we could go, so we made reservations. It was hard to find rooms. It's all booked everywhere. And we managed to get Chateau Louis, and we got our rooms there, and we broadcast right from my room in the language. And because they have fiber optic, our broadcast was just perfect. We had no technical problems. I operated and also produced all the languages, and we had three hours a day. And leading up to that first broadcast we did, in the first hour, I was telling the group that we have to tell the people who the Pope is. And so we had to Google and find out who he was and where he lived before he went to Rome and became a Pope. And he was an activist for the people. And when we say Dene, we mean the people. And when we say Inuit, it means the people too. We don't classify ourselves, so we're all Dene here. So we broadcast in all the different languages and translated what the Pope said. We went to the Sacred Heart Church. We attended Mass there. We also went to the stadium and attended another Mass there. We couldn't go to Lac Sainte Anne or Musqueam, but we depended on the news in Edmonton, CBC Edmonton. We got the latest information that we can get, and also back home in Yellowknife, they were also getting all their news from what the media was saying, the different reporters, and they were also giving us information. So we were translating what we were getting from them. And, you know, like to our people, the Pope is just another human being. But he is a man of prayer to our people. And he dedicated his life to the Creator. And so this is why they have totally respect for the Pope and who he represents. You know, to our people, the Creator is who they're praying to, not the Pope. And what happened in the residential schools. I'm also a survivor. I've been in the residential school for 9 years. Not because, you know, my parents wanted me to go, but we only had two-room classroom in Fort Good Hope, where I'm from. So, you know, all summer we're in fish camp, and my parents didn't register us right away. So by the time we got back into the community, everybody else is registered, and we couldn't, like, there's only 2 classrooms. So we were sent off to Nuvik to residential school. And I first went to residential school when I was 7 years old. And I didn't start speaking English until I was about 7 years old. I went the first year to Fort Good Hope School when I was 6 years old, when I first attended school. But I only spoke my language, and all we did was play because we couldn't communicate in English. So they just made us play, and that's all we did. But when I went at 7 years old, that's when I really started learning. And even before Christmas, I got to start speaking my language. Start speaking English. And my sister Judy was my translator. So I managed to keep my language. And when we got home, like, my parents didn't speak English as well. So we always spoke our language at home. So my language was always with me. and I can express myself better in my language. And being in residential school, you know, it's not what the church did, it's the people that work for the church that did the harm to our people. And when you talk to elders, they always say there's no higher power than the Creator. And to our people, they look at us one people. You have one world, one moon, one sun. And we're all people. And who they pray to is the Creator, not to the Pope. The Pope, they look at him as a man of faith. And so, you know, like I always understood that. I have no anger towards the church. I still go to the Catholic Church, but I only go when I want to go. Because we were really forced to pray when we were in the Catholic residential school. So sometimes I feel like, I even told my parents that I didn't feel like I had to go to church every Sunday. Because when I go to church sometimes, I just totally block out what was said in church. And I walk out of church. If anybody asked me what I heard, I don't remember. I couldn't tell you. So I just felt like I was being like, you know, phony and not, I wanted to feel it in my heart. So if I really want to, like sometimes when I pray on my own, I really pray from my heart. And that's how I want to do that in church. So when I feel like going, that's when I really pray from my heart to the Creator. And, you know, over the years you learn and you also heal. And our people always talk about love. Once you have that love for one another and for the Creator, you can heal, but it'll take time. There are times like there's some even food that I can't eat today, you know, and I know I'm not totally healed. Or when I'm put in a certain situation, you know, I'm kind of reluctant to deal with some of these issues that I had. I don't like being forced. I guess I get that from the residential school. But with my job with CBC, it really taken me out of my shell, and it really helped me, like to find my voice and to work with my people. And I always have to remind myself, you know, I'm doing this for my people. I have to help my people. Their voices, their stories, their legends, their songs. And when we were in Edmonton, we played a lot of their traditional songs. Because from our people, we have people that have dreams, and they have songs that came from their dreams. And if you listen to the words that they say in their songs, it's talking to the spirit people. And so we played a lot of the spiritual songs on our show those few days that we were in Edmonton. And we talked to people that were right on the ground, right in Lac St. Anne, and Muscatries, in Edmonton, wherever they are. They talk to us, and they're telling us how they felt, what it meant to them to see the Pope. And also some of them talked about being in residential school as well. And the other thing was that when we went to, we had to start like 5 in the morning. We went through a lot of security. They checked all our baggage. They had dogs, and it just took hours And I don't know why they had to get us up 5 o'clock in the morning to go to the convention center. But we had to go through all that, and then we made our way to Sacred Heart. Everything happened right in front of us. There was a lot of people. There were mixed people. There was a lot of white people. There was black people. There was a lot of our people there, a lot of Indigenous people from all over. And, you know, when we were even trying to book rooms, we even checked into campgrounds, and they were all booked too. We're thinking, well, you know, the last thing we could probably do is probably get our own tents and just pitch up our tent and see if we could cover it that way. But we managed to get rooms at the Chateau Louis, and we had a Comrax, and we broadcast, and that was the most reliable equipment, they tell us, so that's what we used instead of using tie line or other equipment. And it was just excellent. And we managed to talk to people that were out there, even though we couldn't make it to Lac Sainte Anne, but we also seen from the TV what was going on as well. Also, some of the some of the Indigenous broadcasters did play-by-play in the language, what they were seeing. And one of the elders told us that, you know, they used to go to Edmonton a long time ago, before Edmonton was even a city. They had to travel all the way from Fort Good Hope, all the way down to Fort Smith, through Fort Chipewyan, all the way down to Edmonton to get supplies. And they remember Edmonton, it used to be just a fort where they had all these fences to keep the enemy out. And it was just amazing. They even have name for Edmonton. They call it a row of houses. I guess that's how they remember the place. So, you know, we had stories like that. It was quite different from what we've seen in the English language on the TV and hearing it on the radio. Our people are very spiritual. They always tell us there's life after death, life continues. We believe in reincarnation, and we always believe in the Creator. And that's the thing that the elders always say today, that our young people are really going on a different road. They don't have the faith, because a lot of us are from residential schools where we were lost that skill to teach our young ones how to pray to the Creator. But I know that a lot of the young people are really beginning to learn. They're really getting back out to the land with our elders, are really teaching them. And that's really good to see. And a lot of our people, too, are really sobering up. I see a lot of elders and even young people living the way that our elders always want us to live, is live a sobered life, live a good life, be the best you can be honest, be truthful, and you'll see a good place in the end when you pass. Everybody's going to pass one day, and that's where you have to prepare yourself. And our young people, and they always talk about the future generations. They want to continue for our young people to remember our stories and all their songs, so that they can carry on. And also our language. We're really losing a lot of our elders that told all these stories. Our elders tell us these stories, and I work with these stories for 40 years. They talk about when there was animals who used to talk with us. We lost that language. We don't communicate with the wildlife anymore. They talked about when the north used to be tropic. They even have words for tigers, elephants. They talk about giants. These are the times that they live, and they know about place names. And when I really think about it, it's not that they remember all the, through the maps where all the names. It's all where they've been. And they traveled everywhere. They traveled among the Inuits. They traveled to the Yukon people. And they spoke different languages as well. There's some elders that could understand all the Dene languages, and they listened to us right from 1 till 4 o'clock. And we're losing a lot of those people. So we have to continue trying to hang on to our language, because that's the direct link to our people and to our ancient times. And even like when they're talking about global warming, it's just going back to how it used to be. In the north used to be tropical at one time. We're just going through the changes. But how do we survive through those changes? And I think if we know the stories of our people, we can survive. I'm also working on a podcast. It's our language is our way of life. And those stories are going to come back. Those stories will come back through our young people. We start working with the languages, and the young people are beginning to learn our language through mentorship. Some of them are really interested in learning their language, learning the stories, and it's really good. It's something to celebrate. Masi.
Thank you, Lisa. Thanks to all of you. That was fascinating. I didn't know some of the stuff, especially the competition between Brittany and Kahnawà on the plane. So we do have time for questions. We're going to turn it on the journalists and ask them questions. I have like 10, but I think I can let someone else go first. There's a microphone right in the middle if anyone doesn't want to yell from their table.
My name is Bert Crowfoot. I'm from Alberta, in media for 46 years. I was at the original Pope visit at Fort Simpson in 1986 as a photographer, so I got to document. I was 4 or 5 feet from the Pope. They didn't have the Secret Service like you guys went through, so I was fortunate. I had full range. He went and shook hands with everybody, so that was great. But the question I wanted to ask was, the gasp heard around the world when Willie presented the headdress. And so, I was like, oh my God, Willie, don't. And Willie's a good friend of mine, very well respected, has 7 doctorates, that's honorary doctorates, so very well respected. And he's got death threats over this. And so, after the Battle of the Little Bighorn, Sitting Bull came up to Cypress Hills. And that's Blackfoot territory, my territory. And so he called for Crowfoot, my great-great-grandfather, and Red Crow, and they met with him. And they had a negotiation where they said that we won't fight each other, we won't raid each other, we won't steal your women or horses or stuff like that. So they were saying that this is going to be a peaceful situation. And so Sitting Bull transferred a headdress to my great-great-grandfather and to Red Crow. And so the transfer of headdress is not giving a white man a gift. It's actually the final pact of signing a treaty between 2 nations, between the Blackfoot and the Sioux. So what Willie did was the Pope apologized. He gave him a headdress, And that headdress signified a new beginning you got the apology, a new beginning between the church and Indigenous people. The second thing that people don't understand was, I said, Willie, all these years the church tried to make white people out of Indians. You made the Pope an Indian. You know, you put the headdress on him, and so to me that was, you counted coup. So to me that's what I took away from it. And I saw so many young people that were so mad, death threats and everything else, but they didn't realize the significance of the headdress transfer, or of Willie actually making the Pope into an Indian after centuries of them trying to make us into white people. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Yes, thanks for pointing that out, Bert. I was profiling Chief Littlechild and then was on the same plane with him across Canada. And I asked him about that because I seen the reactions online and people were freaking out and attacking him personally. And he is a survivor, so he was already going through that experience, plus having advocated for all of those years for that to happen. And he told me how, it had been a decision within his own family that they had discussed it, that headdress belonged to his great-grandfather, and that they had decided to gift it. It's not a gift, it's more of a responsibility. And that was his decision. And he told me, I don't go and tell these other nations what they can and can't do. And it was a little like, I can understand there's all these different reactions and people are upset, but when they were attacking him and calling him names, and he's an elder who's a survivor, and I didn't realize that he got death threats, then that's just, it's very, very disturbing. It also demonstrates this broad spectrum of where people are at.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was a day or so after, was knocking on Wilton Littlechild's office, and he'd agreed to do a profile with me, and he was sitting there quite shaken, honestly, by the amount of comment, and I don't even think that he anticipated, being the weight of that symbolism and the way that everybody would react to it, because like he said, he grew up in a culture where you wouldn't be commenting on somebody else's. But as somebody who'd worked his entire life and was groundbreaker, it was really interesting, and maybe we're more familiar with Wilton Littlechild in the prairies, but he's a legend there. So to see what some of the people said about him was quite shocking. He had a letter, and he was reading some correspondence to me that he'd received, and this speaks to his character, and I guess I'll honor that and not tell you who wrote him the message, because he didn't want that on the record. But it was somebody who he could have used very easily as like, this person agrees with me. I'll tell you after. I can't, there's a camera, I can't say it. So he read out this comment, and it was much like you said, it was describing the responsibility and the way that this is one further step on an apology. And what was really important to Dr. Littlechild was that people understand that for the first time, the Pope said that the native spirituality was okay. And that's what really touched him, that like he said that like our people, our ways weren't wrong. I could go on, like he as somebody who's survived himself and was not, doesn't know his brothers and sisters as themselves, he's hardly somebody that like isn't in the experience. And so he made that decision after deep thought.
So quickly, I just want to introduce Tina House with APTN, who ran from the airport and is probably very tired. So thanks for getting here in time to tell us about your experience in covering the Pope story, because I know you were in Rome and in Canada. And yeah, just tell us about your experience.
Awesome, thank you. First of all, it's a real honor to be here, and so nice to see so many familiar faces out in the crowd. hello to my APTN colleagues, and I look forward to meeting the rest of the delegates here over the next couple of days. It's nice to sit on the panel here with such esteemed journalists. Many of us were in Rome together, we were in Musqueam together, we were right in the front lines together covering these stories of survivors. I think since the 215 were discovered is when I first really started focusing on this issue. I was actually on holidays, and the publicist of The Nation said, "You've got to come to Kamloops." And I said, "Well, I'm on vacation right now." She said, "No, you've got to come to Kamloops. It's important." So I said, okay. Took myself off vacation, on the road the next morning to Kamloops, and then I found out what it was about. And it just rocked the world. I mean, the discovery of the 215, that really was the fire starter to launch so many movements and awareness right around the world. I mean, outpouring of support from different nations around the world was just incredible. We did attend Rome together, many of us here on the panel. And for me personally, I'm Métis. My grandmother did go to residential school. And being there as a video journalist to cover that was something that I never thought was possible that I would be able to do one day, is to help amplify those stories. But to witness what happened over there was very magical, because there was a lot of people that were against the delegation going. But for those delegates that did go, I could really truly see transformation. I could see the elders as they walked out of that room that day after that first apology. It was like a weight had been lifted, and you could feel it. It was evident, definitely evident. Going forward to 6 months later when he came to Canada, that was also a very, very moving moment. For me personally, I think what really stands out was when the drummers and elders and singers danced out that red banner of the over 4,000 names of documented kids that never made it home. Yes, in Musqueam, yeah. And just to see all those names, I mean, it's just visually to take that in, it's just something you just can't even imagine, because those names represent a person, a child that never got to truly, fulfill their destinies. Lost loved ones that have been wondering whatever happened to their lost loved one when they got taken away to school. So, it's been a real journey for me ever since, covering this story. And I just want to pay tribute to the many survivors that have trusted me with their stories. I just really hold my hands up high to all of them for being so courageous and so strong to tell their truth. And so much of it is, they're my heroes. Forget about superheroes. Those elders are my heroes, because without their voices, without their truth, we would not be here today discussing this. We would not have had 2 apologies from the Pope. We would not have the doctrine of discovery rescinded, well, hopefully rescinded, but certainly, he did speak highly about getting rid of it, but it's going to be a big process. But as we know, it stems down to that doctrine of discovery and the colonizing of nations around the globe. And so there's a lot of work that yet needs to be done from the church. Honestly, in my own opinion, I don't think we would have gotten that apology if it wasn't the Pope that we have now. Obviously, he wasn't the Pope when all this was happening with the residential schools, but, when he was left with those baby moccasins from the chief in Saskatchewan to keep overnight, and the baby basket, what's the traditional? The cradle, the baby cradle, an empty baby cradle, he was gifted that also overnight to sit with after the First Nations had gone in and had their private one-on-one meeting with him. And obviously it made an impact on him. Who wouldn't be impacted by that, to see an empty baby cradle and realizing what it meant and the symbology of it. So, it's been really, truly my honor to represent our network in so many capacities, and working with an extremely amazing crew. I hold my hands up high to all of you guys. And it's just really been an amazing journey, and I'm looking forward to continuing to tell those stories, to uncover the truth, and to possibly make change and get some justice for these families. Thank you.
We still have time for questions, if anyone wants to ask any. And if not, oh, yeah.
When the 215 were discovered, Simon, Charlene, my colleague, and I hit the road and went to Kamloops. And all the journalists were there. I mean, everybody was there from every network you can imagine, every newspaper, every radio. And I was the only journalist to be allowed exclusive access inside the school. And I was given that access because of the trust that I've instilled within the nation, but also because I am Indigenous. And I think that that really had a big play in why I got access. I walked the halls with a former survivor of that school, Rose Miller, and she's 78 years old. And, you know, it was the most amazing and powerful moment ever to watch her walk through the halls and literally stop every 5 feet or so and say, "This happened here. I remember. I used to have to scrub these steps with my toothbrush, and you know, I remember standing here at this window and waiting for my mom and dad to come and get me, and I'd come every day and I'd cry and I wonder why they didn't come. And you know, I remember what happened here in this hallway." Like it was like you could see in her eyes that she was a child again, when you could look through her eyes as she was telling these stories. And what happened was we have an arrangement with CTV National News, with APTN National News. And they heard that I got the exclusive inside the school. So of course, you know, CTV National News wanted the story. So we shared our story with them, and you know, we were warned beforehand. One of my colleagues, Kenneth Jackson, he argued with the producers. He said, "Don't give it to them. They're going to cut you out. You got the exclusive. Don't give them the story." Well, Kenneth was like, "Nope, don't do it, Tina. Don't let them do it." Well, anyway, they said, "Oh, no, it's okay. It's CTV National News. Everything's going to be fine and no worries." Well, sure enough, they took my story. They revoiced the script that I wrote and didn't even mention me once. So I wasn't very happy about that. The very next time I'm back in Kamloops, which is 2 weeks later, covering another story where the community of Chase, BC, they walked the spirits home from the school, which is like maybe an hour away or something. But it was an amazing sunrise ceremony they did at the river, and they actually walked the spirits of their children home back to their community. And again, I got, you know, an incredible story. It was like 4.5 minutes or something like that. And I sent it to Lisa Laflamme, who was then the anchor there. And she said, "Yeah, we want this story too." And I said, "Okay, well, here's how it's going to work out." I said, "I'm going to do the story now on CTV National News. You will no longer assign one of your reporters. I'm going to do it myself because it's my story." She said, "Well, that's not really our policy." And I said, "Well, you better change your policy then." So sure enough, within the hour, they said, "Yep, can you cut it down to 2.5 minutes?" I said, "Yep." That's it. So for the first time, I was an outside journalist reporting on their platform, telling our stories. So that was good. Thank you.
I have a similar story to when I found out when I found out I was going on this assignment. I'm still the only full-time Indigenous reporter for the Globe and Mail. We have one other columnist who's Indigenous. Other than that, I'm the only one across the country. So I don't know why I was so surprised when my editor called me. So the delegation visit was first scheduled for December of 2021. And she called me maybe 2 weeks before that. I had known the trip was coming up. It was all very last minute when the dates were confirmed. But I didn't really think anything until she called me and she started talking about it. She's like, yeah, you know, this is happening. I'm like, oh yeah, I've heard about it and all of that. And she's like, kind of going on a little bit. And she's like, so do you want to go and cover it? I'm like, okay. And she didn't ask if I had a passport. I didn't have a passport. And I didn't even tell her that. I was like, I don't want that to be like a reason why I'm not going. So, because the furthest south I think I had ever been at that point was maybe like Wisconsin Dells. So I was like, no need for a passport. That December trip ended up getting postponed because of COVID to the spring. By then I was able to get my passport. But I just remember being really, I don't know why I was so shocked. I was like, oh my God, I can't believe she's asking me. Like, but I went with one other reporter from the Globe, non-Indigenous, who's done a lot of work on the Catholic Church stuff of residential schools. We had a Rome correspondent there, and then we had a freelance photographer from Rome there as well. But the one thing I discovered and was so important and so nice was the presence of Indigenous media during that trip. The presence of media was international, it was global, it was very large, and there were several of us that were Indigenous that were there. Which was amazing because that was such a contrast. I had one of the stories I did during that trip was on Phil Fontaine, the former national chief of the Assembly of First Nations, who was part of the First Nation delegation. He had gone to Rome in the 1990s, I can't remember exactly which year, to ask for an apology from the Pope then. He didn't get it at the time. He was maybe like, there was just a few of them that went on that trip, and the media presence was like almost nothing. I think maybe the Globe had maybe one or two stories, very short stories on that trip, but other than that, nothing. And so I was just like, Kamloops changed everything, I think, for that. For some reason, the world needed to hear that in order to open their eyes. But and thankfully, now, decades after the 90s, we have a fairly good number of Indigenous journalists working on national stories, but not nearly enough. So, yeah, I think that's all I want to say.
It was said that one of the reasons, not the only reason why I was chosen was because I am Indigenous or First Nations, and I don't know how I felt about that. But then when I look back, I'm like, would the questions that we asked, would they have been asked if non-Indigenous journalists were on that flight, if it was only non-Indigenous journalists? Would we have pushed, like Ganesio did, when the Pope kind of feigned confusion? We'll say. And I don't actually know the answer. I think that media has certainly changed. It's been slow. Granted, I have only been doing this for 7 or 8 years. I think that there is still some hesitancy to have Indigenous journalists cover these big stories. I don't know if there's still that mindset of, they're going to be biased or whatever the case may be. But I think that, Indigenous journalists everywhere are pushing back on that. And we should be there to not only just cover Indigenous stories, but to cover other different stories, because we are going to come at it from a different worldview. And we are going to ask questions like, I've been told so many times from non-Indigenous national reporters, like, oh, I didn't even think to ask that question. And I'm like, okay, well, you obviously maybe don't know what's going on then. Like, if that's the case, like, there's very white privilege there. So, yeah, I think, and with CP, I mean, I can't speak to the past, but I know, like, in my time of being there, we've hired someone in Ottawa, And I think that who's Indigenous, and I think that there needs to be, especially in Ottawa, holding those powers to account, more Indigenous journalists on the Hill. But I also have heard that it's not always a friendly place for Indigenous journalists. But we need to be taking up those spaces and holding that power to account. And you know, we just hired someone, Edmonton. So I really hope that that you know, it continues and we get those voices, because I've had editors who are non-Indigenous have kind of said to me, like, oh, that's like a really interesting story, or like I you know. And one of the things that, on a little tangent, that I kind of, when I was switching over to CP from APTN, I said, in the interviews, I said, I'm not just here to tell like trauma stories. I'm not just gonna like we need to be there for their good as well. Like, I want to tell stories about youth succeeding in community. I want to tell stories about just people doing everyday regular things in their community and how much that means. And that is really important to me. And that is something that I have continued to do, and I get the space to do that. So I am very appreciative of that. And I think slowly, maybe not as fast enough, we are kind of seeing a more openness.
I know you asked for the non-CBC journalists, but I'm still going to weigh in. Because I think I still felt like a level of like imposter syndrome of like, you know, even though I did complain about it, like that there needs to be an Indigenous journalist or more Indigenous journalists covering when he comes to Canada. When I complained about that, I didn't mean put me on a plane. I didn't even know that was an option. So when I was asked, there was that level of imposter syndrome. I was like, am I being pitied because I came back from stress leave? Like that's, like I had those types of questions. And then, you know, even just, there are way more talented Indigenous journalists at the CBC compared to me that like actually like going on camera. You know, I didn't even do any like broadcasts during that trip. So, you know, like I had those questions myself, and I'm still like, no idea why I was chosen. So that's my 2 cents.
Any last questions, maybe? Because I know we've kind of hit our time. We could like talk forever. Brandy also has a video that we thought.
Yeah, just wanted to end it by sharing this video with you guys. Can you guys see, or do we need to dim the lights? Can you see the screen? So I'm creating a documentary about the papal apology. We filmed from Rome all the way through Canada, and this is the rough trailer for that. You might recognize some of the people and the survivors that we're featuring, and this trailer's never been shown publicly before.
One second.
Oh, we need to pause it. I have been covering the stories of residential school survivors. Too loud. I'm going to start it again. Okay. I have been covering the stories of residential school survivors for years and years. I have been to their homes. I have walked with them through grave sites where they helped dig the graves for their fellow classmates. This is all coming full circle. Traveling to the Vatican, to Rome, where colonization was literally born. So I'm here with residential school survivors that are having a series of meetings with Pope Francis. In one sense, I'm completely overwhelmed, to be here, because it is such a stunning place filled with incredible history, but the contrast of the violence too that it represents.
I said, I want to hear 3 words from you. I am sorry. It's significant for me anyway, to acknowledge the power of forgiveness. Because once that happens, then people will begin to feel a sense of healing.
In that time that he was listening to survivors, and as he was listening to their stories, you could see that he could feel pain. And you could see it on his face.
Normalized for me to grow up with a mom who would wake up in the middle of the night screaming, or who would not sleep on a regular bed, traumatized in residential school because bad things happened to her in the bed.
Just trying to make sure that the message of MMIWG to us is out there.
It did something to me that I have never shared. When I was 5 years old, they cut me here as a 5-year-old boy with 17 stitches.
We would like the Pope personally to intervene in the case of a priest. He has a history of sexual abuse in Inuit.
Whereas I'm not just like this robotic reporter, like it affects me because I have family members who are survivors and we're all connected by this, right? And so we're all experiencing this together.
I've had people ask me, how do you reconcile, the negative aspects of the history of the Catholic Church with Native peoples, and I tell them that, in my own life, we need to forgive those things and that do not allow anger and hatred to consume us.
And I want to say to you with all my heart, I am very sorry. And I join my brothers, the Canadian bishops.
They tried to take our culture away. They tried to take our laws away. So for us to be practicing our laws right here at Vatican City, like we're still here, we still have this, that's where I'm like.
And I said, I don't care how much this hurts, because from sports I have a spinal injury and I have a broken hip. I said, I'm gonna dance, so I did.
Not done. This is part 2.
As far as I understand, just because you give somebody a headdress doesn't necessarily mean that they are being honored. It means that they have a responsibility. It was beautiful to see all the different nations represented that came, and they were proud and still here. I just knew that it was special, and I knew that it was important, and I was grateful because, like my mom, I think for her that was healing for her to come. To be the survivors that are front and center. And it just seems like 4 days in that the purpose of why he's here is getting buried.
And a woman was not to acknowledge the Pope. I did. You weren't supposed to do that? Well, if I don't, then who will? If not now, then when?
coming to Inuit lands is very important. So that inclusion is it's not just symbolic, it's an important message that he's sending everywhere, that he is willing to go to the ends of the earth, to the high Arctic, to where beautiful people Inuit live.
So you need to look at it, with a way to look at things, as reality. Is that from day one, they've, their way of doing things is to get rid of us. This is our home. This is our family. What has happened is wrong. It's a sin. It's a crime, and and they need to be accountable for these things.
And it was really an incredible moment because I saw the impact that it had on them. And to feel their emotion and just see how it actually truly impacted them. It was so powerful because of just our story.
Like our people's communities and families were broken and tore apart. You tear the children from the families and you put the children literally through hell, and that circle, that broken circle is, it's reforming. It's a painful process, but it's also a really it's a really beautiful thing too, and that's what I'm seeing. Hi everybody for watching.
So thank you, panelists. Thank you, everyone. Good night. Thanks so much, guys. Thanks a lot.